Hello everyone, this is Halmurat. I am an Uyghur rights activist based in Finland. Today we are honored to have Mr. Olsi Jazexhi to our program. Hello Mr. Olsi, welcome to our program.
Hello, salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam. My first question is about your trip to the China and the Uyghur region, or East Turkistan, as Uyghurs prefer to call their homeland. You went to China with a state-sponsored tour, visited model camps building by the Chinese authority to, I guess, they prepared those camps for showing to the foreigners to hide the ugly fact of sending millions of Uyghurs to I prefer to call the concentration camps because what's happening there, as long as I know, it is akin to what Nazi Germany did to the Jewish people during the World War II. I don't mean it is a death camp yet, but it is a concentration camp. They send the innocent people without any trial, and it's already well over a year and a half. The people being detained in those concentration camps. So, could you please briefly tell us about what was your thoughts before you go to this trip to see those camps, and what did you see in those camps, and what makes you change your mind?
Well, before going to China, I had a very positive uh, thoughts about China uh, because, in a way, China claims to the outside world to be a socialist country, uh, and because the version of capitalism that we are witnessing in the world nowadays after the fall of the Soviet Union is very horrible. And because very often we see that powers in the West uh, make up conflicts and attack countries of the third world, and because we have seen what happened in Syria and so forth. And moreover, the pressure that the Americans and Israelis do against many Muslim countries like Turkey, Iran, Qatar, Syria, Libya, Iraq, etc. My idea and desire was to prove to the world that the issue of the concentration camps in China is not true. I've seen many videos and reporting from Western media outlets, but since I'm very skeptical to them because they usually follow a political agenda. So I had the opinion that the story of the concentration camps in Xinjiang, Turkestan was fake. And with this idea in mind, I approached the Chinese embassy here in Tirana, Albania. And I told to them about myself and my suspicions about the Western reports about Xinjiang. And I asked them if they had any program for foreign journalists who could go into China and see themselves the reality. So our Chinese friends, after my introduction, they liked my CV and my thoughts probably. And for this reason, in August, they invited me to visit Xinjiang. I was in Xinjiang from 16 to 25 of August, where we visited three major cities, Urumqi, Aksu, and Kashgar. Yeah. Any question?
Oh yeah, like I mean, like what you see in those camps, and as you told us in this interview and the many other interviews, like your videos, for example, you were skeptical about the situation of Xinjiang, about because the things happen in the West and the things happening this after post-Soviet world, and you kind of think that maybe it's not true that Chinese authority really oppressing Uyghurs in this way on in these scales. But what did you see in those camps, and what makes your mind changed?
Well, before visiting the camps, our Chinese friends sent us in Urumqi in a hotel there, and for 3 days they presented us with the Han Chinese perspective on Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. The presentations that we had were chauvinistic from the historical point of view and were Han Chinese from their uh, standpoint, how they were seeing the world. The historical narrative that the Chinese gave to us when we were in Urumqi was that Xinjiang has historically been Han Chinese, and that the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Tatars, and others, they are immigrants in Xinjiang. In state museums that we visited in Aksu and in Kashgar and in Urumqi, the Uyghurs were depicted as some kind of primitive people, and other people, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz, while the Han Chinese were depicted as civilized, as people who have the burden to civilize the Muslims of China. So the presentation that we got was very similar to the imperialist presentations that the Europeans made when they invaded Africa, India, and the rest of the globe. When we were visiting the museums at Urumqi, Aksu, and Kashgar, it was like we were reading Rudyard Kipling's infamous poem, The Burden of the White Man. So exactly like the British when they abused and treated the Indians and the Africans as some uncivilized people who had to be civilized by the white man, the kind of thing, the same kind of thing we saw from the Han Chinese. So the Han Chinese were treating you, Indo-European Muslims of Xinjiang and the Turkic Muslims of Xinjiang, as if you were some primitive monkeys that the Han Chinese had to come from Beijing and teach you how to live. In Kashgar, for example, when we visited the Museum of Kashgar, the Uyghurs were shown as some kind of dirty people, people who didn't even know what is the toilet and water. And the Han Chinese were depicted as the people who were coming from the rest of China and were civilizing you, the barbarians, according to the Chinese. As a professional historian that I am, and as a person who have read about Marxism and communism, I was very shocked because the historical depiction that the Chinese were doing for you was very racist that I was prepared to hear from people like Donald Trump, who talks about the shithole countries of Africa and the rest of the world, but not from the Communist Party of China. I was expecting to find a Marxist interpretation of history, or at least a Leninist or a Stalinist, but what I found out was a very racist, imperialist Han Chinese narrative, which in a way was humiliating the Uyghurs. So even the most loyal Uyghur to the Communist Party of China, but who is a bit smart and who reads about history, would feel himself very much humiliated, probably even worse than the blacks in America during the 19th century. I mean, the Muslims of Xinjiang were being treated as the Jews by Nazi propaganda of Hitler during the Second World War, or like the Afro-Americans were treated by the white racists in America during the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. So I was very much shocked, and I could not accept and believe that in a country that claims to be communist, you would find such kind of racist ideology being implemented. There was a system of apartheid in Xinjiang, where almost all state officials that we saw, except very, very few, the majority were Han Chinese. So what we witnessed was, in a way, America, if America were to be ruled by Ku Klux Klan, or America in the time of slavery. Moreover, before going to the concentration camps, when we visited cities like Urumqi and Aksu, we noticed a very heavy military and police presence in these cities. So if you were to be careful in your observations, even though the Chinese had put into our service all the state apparatus, the police and everybody, but if you were to be a very careful observer, you would have understood that the Chinese were treating Xinjiang as an occupied territory. So by seeing the police and military presence and heavy security in airports and everywhere, you had the impression as if you were in West Bank, where the Israeli police and military have built checkpoints in every corner and in every street of the occupied Palestinian territories. Nevertheless, because in December 2018, I was in Palestine and I saw myself the apartheid regime of the Israelis against Palestinians. However, the thing that shocked me a lot, that I didn't see in Palestine and in Israel, was that the Chinese were, apart from treating the Uyghurs and Dogu Turkistan as an occupied territory, they had built even concentration camps. During our stay in Urumqi, our Chinese hosts, they lectured to us a lot about the so-called vocational training centers that the Chinese authorities had built for fighting extremism and terrorism. What happened in the fourth or the fifth day of our visit, they presented us with the first vocational training center, which in fact was not the school, but was the concentration camp, which was painted and designed in a way to cheat us as the foreign journalists and to make us believe that these are schools. They sent us at Wensi County Vocational Training Center, which was in the middle of a desert. And there they presented us with a group of Uyghur boys and girls who were instructed to deceive us, the foreign journalists, and to only sing and dance in front of us. When we went to Wensi County Vocational Training Center, we saw people with Muslim names, people like you. Your name is Muslim, Halmurat. And their names were like Kadri, Mehmet, Ahmed, I don't know, Aisha, Mahmoud. So we saw people when we went to this concentration camp. And when we understood, like the Chinese told us before, that these people were extremist Muslims, we saluted them with Salam Alaikum. But what happened is that when we started to salute them with our Muslim traditions, these poor boys and girls were so afraid that they didn't even dare to respond back to us by telling us Alaikum Salam. They were talking to us in Han Chinese. So when we were telling them Salam Alaikum, they were telling to us Ni Hao. And when we were talking to them in their own Turkic language, they were all the time responding to us in Chinese. This thing shocked us very much and made us very worried, but at the same time made us understand the situation where we were in. Number one, these people, even though the Chinese had told us that they were suicide bombers and terrorists and extremists, when I started to interview them, they were not such. They were innocent people. They were people who 1 year ago had read the Quran or had married according to Muslim tradition, or had prayed to their God, or had asked their mother to pray to their God. So these people, they were innocent. But what the Chinese had done with them, they had put them into these concentration camps where they were brainwashing them 24 hours a day, were keeping them in prison cells, and had forcibly separated them from their families, and were brainwashing and forcing these people to learn Chinese, to obey to Chinese stupid and criminal laws, and reject their ethnic and Islamic identity. The thing that we saw shocked us a lot. It was unacceptable, especially for me as a Muslim who live in a kind of a liberal, anarchic, democratic country like Albania is, or even in Canada. What we saw in Xinjiang was something unimaginable for us. So from this point onwards, I changed my opinion about China. And I even told to our Chinese friends that what you are doing is crazy, is unacceptable. And I told them what you are doing is something unimaginable to be done in the 21st century. You cannot lock people in cages and to treat them as criminals only because they believe in their God or in their ethnic identity.
Thank you. One thing that make many Uyghurs upset is the reaction of the Muslim countries. In a statement to the United Nations, like this summer, like last summer, there were 37 countries, if I remember correctly, come together to define China and commending the country's human rights record, not rampant allegation of its persecution of Uyghurs. Of this list, close to half of the signatures are actually coming from the Muslim majority nations. Make me feel so upset and make me feel like so unbelievable is even the Palestine signed the letter. So why are some Muslim countries standing in solidarity with China? Or is there any kind of, well, I guess maybe because economic and diplomatic relationships. And is there any other reason that you don't really know what is happening to the Uyghurs, Muslim majority nation in Xinjiang or East Turkistan, as Uyghur prefer to call? What do you say about it?
Well, there are a number of reasons, and this question has been made to me in a number of times. The answer number one is that you as Uyghurs should know that there is no Muslim world. Nowadays, many Muslim countries are run by corrupt dictators, people who are not democratically elected. In many Muslim countries, or maybe most of the Muslim countries, or in particular in the Arab countries, you don't have freedom of press, you do not have freedom of thought, you do not have democracy. The dictators, Middle Eastern dictators especially, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in United Arab Emirates, they jail their journalists and they put them to prison. So in these countries, Muslims themselves, intellectuals, Arabs, what have you, are persecuted. When I was in Xinjiang, we had with us delegations of journalists from Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. These people saw exactly what I saw, and if you go through my videos, you will see the Saudis and Emiratis. There are some girls with hijabs who witnessed how the Chinese were sending into concentration camps Uyghur girls only because they had put hijab and because they had read Quran. When we saw what we saw with these Arab journalists, one of these girls who had hijab herself, she started crying. And because they felt very bad about what the Chinese were doing to the Uyghurs. I told them, when you go back to your country, are you going to report it? She told me, no way. I told her why. Because, she said, our government does not allow us. So you have to know this thing, as Uyghurs who will probably see my interview. There is no Muslim world. Muslim world nowadays is undemocratic, run by dictators, by people who are supported by the United States, Israel, France, and other imperialist power. There are some Muslim countries who are trying to do something for the Uyghurs. For example, Turkey is hosting around 50,000 Uyghurs. But we have to understand something, that major Muslim countries, especially non-Arab, like Turkey, like Pakistan, like Malaysia, like Indonesia, they cannot do much about East Turkestan. Why? Number one, they do not share border with China, except Pakistan. Number two, China is a superpower. Number three, some countries, like you have Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, they need China. They need China because China supplies them with weapons, with money, with technology, etc. However, there is a big difference between those countries who support the crimes that China is doing with the Uyghurs, like you have Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, who, when United States, Canada, Great Britain, etc., they signed a letter and they told to China to close the concentration camps. And what happened a few days later, the Saudis, the criminal Saudis, signed another letter without probably even China asking them, and they were supporting the Chinese extermination of Islam in Xinjiang. So you have, in one side, groups of such dictatorial and ruthless countries. On the other hand, you have countries like Turkey, like Qatar, like Malaysia, like Indonesia in a way, who understand the situation of Uyghurs, but cannot do too much about it. The problem today is that the Muslim world is under a constant attack from the Americans. We have the example of Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, who are threatened with embargoes, with military strikes, etc. And these countries, even though they do understand and they do very well know what is going on in Xinjiang, they do not dare to speak up because they perceive China as part of the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Council, where China with Russia, they are trying to build a new bloc against the American and the Israeli imperialism towards the Middle East. And for this reason, they are in a very difficult situation. The Muslim world today is very weak, but I can divide it into two parts. In one side, you have countries who are wholeheartedly supporting the Chinese, like Saudis, Bahrainis, Emiratis, these very same people who have even sold Palestine to Israel, and they are in very good relations with United States and Israel. So these people who do not even care for their own Arabs, you should not expect them to care for you. But on the other hand, you have another group of countries which did not sign the letter in support of China. Countries like Turkey, Qatar, Iran, Pakistan, I think, didn't sign the letter, if I'm not wrong, who, in a way, they do understand the situation, but they cannot do anything. The problem today, Halmurat, is that the world doesn't live in the time of Sultan Murad or Sultan Abdul Hamid, when the Ottomans were a Muslim superpower in the world, and they could send armies and weapons to Dogu Turkestan to liberate the Uyghurs from the Chinese, Han Chinese or Manchurian invasion. We live in a very bad world. The only countries that can do something about Uyghurs are the Western countries with the United States. But because the Uyghurs are not Christians, they are not Israelis. You are not Jews. You are. Unfortunately, you are Muslims. You believe in Allah. You don't believe in Benjamin Netanyahu. So nobody is coming to save you. This is a problem, and this is a tragedy for you. And moreover, another thing that I'm understanding, because I was in Qatar like 2 weeks ago, I've been even in Turkey talking to many intellectuals. There is a very great fear among Muslim intellectuals to raise their voice and to speak about you. since when I visited Xinjiang, East Turkestan, I've been shocked. I mean, my visit in Xinjiang was a visit of lifetime. When I was in December in Israel and Palestine, I thought that Israel and Palestine were the most horrible countries of this planet, where Israelis were shooting Palestinians like being animals. But what I saw in Xinjiang, how the Chinese were mass abducting the Uyghurs and other Muslims and sending them into concentration camps and prohibiting them from practicing their religion and feeding them to eat pork and forcing them to repent for believing in God and forcing them to believe in this idiotic communist party of China. This was even more horrible. I've mentioned in my other presentations saying from Jesus in the Bible, where he advises his followers in his time to do not be afraid from those people who kill your bodies, but fear those who kill your souls. While the Israelis and Americans, they go and kill Muslims from Iraq to Libya, Palestine, what have you. The Chinese were killing souls in these concentration camps. And this is something that have shocked me tremendously. But the greatest shock that I'm having after coming from Xinjiang is that there is very little reaction from the Muslim world. I see even on internet time after time, you have some foolish Arabs who China sends them to visit China, and when they come back, they bring pictures and they say, wow, mashallah, we have Islam in China, we have halal food in China, which fell into the propaganda machine that China is doing to deceive the world. I'm very sad, I'm very disappointed. I went to Al Jazeera in Qatar. I gave an interview there. When we were there, the Chinese were pressuring people around not to allow us to speak. And I'm very shocked that in this very moment of history when we are living, we're witnessing a mass extermination of Islam in Xinjiang, mass incarceration of Muslims only because they believe in their God. And there is no human voice to speak about it. We're witnessing a second Holocaust. We're witnessing concentration camps like in the era of the Nazi Germany, and nobody is saying anything about it. We have only the Americans who speak about it and the British and Canadians, but they do this not because they love Muslims. They do this because of their imperialist agendas. But it is such a pity. I mean, Americans who support Israelis to crush the Palestinians who speak about Uyghurs. And when it comes to the Muslim Ummah, nobody speaks about it. And on the other hand, I see you, the Uyghurs, who are very desperate, very weak. You don't have enough money. You don't have access to the medias. And the world doesn't believe you in most of the cases. I mean, it is really, really crazy, unbelievable how China can get away with murder in such a way. And moreover, the Muslim Ummah, the so-called Muslim ulamas, intellectuals, people who have responsibility, people who read the Quran, who read the history of Moses going and saving the Beni Israel, the Israelis from the Pharaoh, that they do not react about you because your story is very similar to what the Pharaoh was doing to the Jews in time of Moses. He was telling them, I am your highest God. You are not God. You are not going to worship Allah. And he had enslaved them exactly like you are enslaved. And nobody speaks about it. I mean, after coming from Xinjiang and after meeting so many Uyghurs who have shown me how they have lost their children, mother, father, brothers, I feel so bad and I feel so desperate because I have no power to shout and to scream to the world and to tell to the world, please, world, wake up, look what is going on. The hypocritical Muslim world speaks about Kashmir, and they do very well that they do for that. They speak about Palestine, and they do very well speaking for that. They go and fight and kill each other, but nobody speaks about you. It is crazy.
Yeah, indeed. Like there is a many Muslim organization at the West as well, and we know there is a significant amount of the Muslim population in the West, for example, in Europe, especially, then United States and the Canada, where you actually stayed before. And so my question is, why are Muslim communities not break their silence on Uyghurs in those countries? For example, there are some uh, organizations in the West, for example, in England, and some, for example, in Canada, or they organize kind of panels or the small events, but we didn't see that uh, the they are really standing up, doing more kind of things that like they could be more anything like that from them. And there are, rich Muslim families who based in the Western countries, or they are from the countries like Qatar and other places. Now, like the many Uyghur organizations, they are kind of, the suffering, well, because the economic uh, difficulties as well. But we didn't see any such a things coming from the Muslim world, and even the Muslim population in the West and other places. So do they still think it is a CIA conspiracy, the Uyghur plight, or they are busy with fighting against this Islamophobia of the West and hesitate to challenge China, which is the potential ally of them?
Well, the answer is very complicated. Number one, many Muslim organizations that exist in the West, they have their own provincial agendas. So you have, let us say, in the United Kingdom, a Pakistani mosque, a Baluchi mosque, Indian mosque, Egyptian mosque and organization. And each and every organization takes care of its ethnic or sectarian group. Number two is that Muslims in the West, because they face harassment from Western security services, they are not sure what to do. Most of them do humanitarian work. They gather money. They buy food for the poor, and they are not very political. There are few organizations that they are political, but the thing is that many of these organizations, they fight Islamophobia in the West. For example, we have Zaire in the United States. They fight abuse by the police and the system American regime against the Muslims. So the problem is that many of these organizations, they have their own local agendas. And on the other hand, and this is a big failure on you, the Uyghurs, is that you do not have a good PR organizations and campaigns to go and to knock into the doors of these people and to show to these people what is going on. For example, what I've seen with you Uyghurs, you are being invited by major Western media outlets, universities, and you are being used in a way by the high strata of the Western society to attack China, which is very good in a way because your plight is somehow coming across. But then the problem with you is that the message that you are giving to the world goes to the elites of the Western society, and it doesn't go to the mainstream. It doesn't go to the underground. And many Muslims in the West, they are underdogs of the Western societies. They do not talk to the elites, and they look suspiciously even to the messages that the elites make about what is happening in the world. And then what happens is, because the message about what is going on with the Uyghurs in China is coming from major Western propaganda outlets like BBC, CNN, and what have you, there are many people like me, myself, who are suspicious, who say, oh, okay, we're listening from CNN. CNN keeps on telling lies about what American policymakers want to do in the world. So that's a trash and throw it away. One of the reasons why I went to China myself to check what is going on with the Muslims was because when the message about your suffering comes from the elites of the Western societies, then people become very suspicious. They see you in a way as some kind of agents of American imperialism against China. And when it comes to the Muslim communities in the West, even those who love Trump and Pompeo and what have you because they fear them, they do not very easily buy this kind of message. You have to go underground, you have to go to mosques, you have to approach Muslims everywhere, Muslim organizations, and you have to go and knock into the doors of these people with a Muslim message. You have to show them who you are, why you are suffering, and you have to build a mainstream movement among Muslim organizations in the West, but not only Muslims, because what is happening with you is a crime against humanity. So it is not only an Islamic issue, but it is a humanitarian issue. And you have to know something, that in the West, the leftists, the people who protest against American or British bombing of Libya, people who protest against Israeli crimes against Palestine, the leftists, they have a very strong and good network on mobilizing the society and showing to the people what is going on in the world. Unfortunately, you have not been able to penetrate the left and the Muslim civil society in the West and to explain to these people what is really going on. So you have a big problem when it comes to the PR. Since coming from China, I've come to know many people like you, Halmurat, and I think you Uyghurs have to rethink your strategy of telling to the world what is going on. I mean, you do not need the world to go into a nuclear war with China, because NATO and America, they're not going to fight for you. They'll tell to the Chinese, okay, go and do whatever you want because they're Muslims. But you have to touch the human hearts of the Western civil society, especially the European civil society. Because I've seen even many of the videos that you produce, many of them come from WeChat and these Chinese websites, and they're with Chinese letters, and the Chinese are very, very good on filtering and on not allowing the outside world to know what is going on about you. So the big problem that you have is that you are not able to convey to the world the message of what China is doing with you. Because on one side, you have China that militarily controls and isolates Turkistan, East Turkistan. On the other hand, you have only the big mainstream Western medias who talk about you, but even when they talk just a few seconds and that's it. And this is a big problem. And the mainstream society, the Western civil, and particularly the European civil society, when they see you going with the Americans, they say, these are some American puppets. And your plight, the suffering of your people gets ignored. And the thing that makes me crazy now after coming from Xinjiang is that I see how little the outside world knows about what is going on with you. Down there in Xinjiang, there is a military occupation of Xinjiang. You have Muslims being sent into concentration camps, into prisons, people being executed, mosques being bulldozed. And for the world outside, there is nothing. Because China has been very smart on building a huge wall of a huge firewall, of filtering everything, of blocking anything, and people know nothing. The same situation I noticed when I was in Israel, when I visited Tel Aviv, and I had the chance to talk with some Israelis after I had visited the occupied territories. And when I had a discussion with a lady on a train from Tel Aviv to Ben Gurion, and I told her, Madam, do you know what goes on if you cross the Kalandia checking point in Jerusalem? How the Israeli army treats the Palestinians? She didn't know anything, and I was shocked. And you told me, you know why, Olsi? Because we have a censorship in Israel. They have the wall. The Israelis, the humanistic Israelis, are not allowed to cross the wall and to go into Palestinian territories. And even though the distance between Tel Aviv and the Palestinian occupied territories was probably 30 kilometers, and if you cross the wall in Palestine, you see human suffering, you see the Israeli army bulldozing and killing people. 30 kilometers, when you cross the wall into Israel, there was nothing. People were happy, and people didn't even know what is going on behind the wall. The same story is with you. China has a much bigger wall than Israel has. China is much more technologically sophisticated on isolating you guys in the mountains of Turkestan, and the outside world doesn't know anything. And when we talk to the outside world, they suspect us. They think that we're lying. They think that we're not telling the truth. This is a big problem that you have.
Thank you. Thank you for today, your time, and it's really honored to have you on our program. Hope to see you again in another program.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.